and technologies, I'm now able to stream the show live on 10 different streams simultaneously. So,
That's awesome.
yeah, so I'm figuring it all out here. All right, and here we are back. Charles Moscowitz, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining me, everyone. I have an author this segment, Uncensored America, Girls with Guns expert. Thanks for joining me, Allie. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So first of all, talk a little bit about your show. I'm curious how you do it and when and where and all of that.
Yeah, so I actually own a marketing business. I work with local businesses and local marketers. And so my podcast is called Marketing Inc., Big Ideas for Local Businesses. And so that's usually once a week, sometimes twice a week. I'm just on all the major podcast directories. And it's a really great podcast for people who are in the local business space who really want to improve their revenue and profitability. And I love it. So it's a great way to help people.
For sure. So you bring people on for like an interview, like half-hour interview, or like a kind of an infomercial to talk about their business and what they're doing. And is that what you do?
So I have some episodes that are just me, and I'm really going through different tactics and strategies. I work a lot in the digital marketing space. So being able to give people ideas that they can implement to improve their businesses. And then I also do interviews with other entrepreneurs, people in the marketing space, people in the local business space to share their experience and whatever their specialty is so that my audience can get a taste of a lot of different things that may be able to help them.
Excellent. So you've written a book called Uncensored America, Thought-Provoking Poetry on Faith, Family, and Freedom, which touches on an issue that I think that anyone who is not part of the present supporters of the present government, let's just put it that way, are dealing with these issues of censorship right now, including me on YouTube, on YouTube and all the other platforms. I think that this is a problem that's going to probably get worse before it gets better. Where do you see us being at this time with all of that?
With the gun regulations specifically?
Or generally with censorship?
I think it's a very serious issue that we're facing. So my business focuses pretty heavily on Facebook and Instagram ads. And so I see it each and every day, not only in the advertising space, but obviously in the personal sphere. And the issue here is that the companies that are really the information highways of our present day, there are no checks and balances on them. They are private companies, which I fully support capitalism. But when you have a small group, maybe 5 people that control most of our information highways in the world today, who have zero real regulations in terms of what they can and cannot do, that becomes a very serious problem. And especially once we see the politicizing of these platforms coming into play, stories being suppressed, accounts being locked, people being banned simply because of their ideology or because certain people would prefer that information not be out there. It is a massive issue because so few people are reading traditional newspapers and things like that. This is how we get our information. And so censorship is not limited to print. It's limited to any medium. And it's something that I really wish had been addressed years ago. In all honesty, I've been talking about this since 2016 or 2017, wanting Section 230 to be either repealed or, just amended in general. At this point, that's obviously probably not going to happen, but I was very, very pleased to hear Justice Thomas recently come out talking about the technology platforms and how serious he believes this issue is, and just knowing how much judges across the country are expected to look to the Supreme Court for their guidance on how to rule. I do think he was in a very clear, succinct, and compelling way speaking out about what needs to be done and how serious this problem really is.
Yes, that was very inspiring to look at. And I think that the classic example of the kind of censorship we're dealing with right now is the fact that Twitter and Facebook could censor a sitting president of the United States by taking Donald Trump's accounts and closing them. And not only closing them, but even recently President Trump was interviewed by his daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, and that was taken down from Facebook. Can you imagine that? I mean, this is, if that can happen to the president, it can happen to you, it could happen to anyone. We're talking about a very narrow group of people controlling the means of communication in this country and in this world. So, but you talk about, of course, a very controversial issue. As I said, girls with guns. Your book gets into the question of gun ownership and the increase of the number of young women of all ages, who are now packing a piece, I guess you might say. What's the deal?
Well, I think if you just look at the world around us, you'll see that it is full of violence and sadly evil people. And that's not going to change, unfortunately. But we can't be sitting ducks. Women see that they are often victims of violent crime because, if there is a man and it's a perpetrator, women are, in most cases, less physically capable of defending themselves against a man. And if they have a knife, if they have a gun, what else are you going to do to defend yourself? And especially as you start to have children, you really see this in a much more significant way, not only for your own life, knowing that some other human depends on you completely, but also that child as well. If I am anywhere with my daughter, I know that I can defend myself and her should the unthinkable take place. And unfortunately, it does take place. I think that often these mass shootings are highly politicized, unfortunately, but they are tragic and no one ever knows when they're going to take place. So it's not really something to where you can just say, oh, I have a firearm and it's at home in case I have an intruder. Yes, that's a great thing to do. But for me personally, being able to carry my firearm and know that it is with me at all times in any situation, so that should I be in the wrong place at the wrong time, I'm able to do something about it. And I think many other women are waking up to that exact same fact, and gun ownership is growing tremendously.
Now, the another very good program, I think, particularly for young women, is called Model Mugging, where you learn to fight if somebody assaults you in different scenarios. I know somebody who did that. It was very, very effective. But, I've also heard the argument, and I'm playing a little bit of a devil's advocate here, I guess, that owning and having a handgun is not actually a deterrent to crime. It actually could lead to more violence. But I think that has more to do with whether or not you know how to use it.
I agree. And also, I think part of that is really the deception in the people that are discussing the statistics, because the majority of all gun crime, I believe it's 60 to 65%. It's suicide. Suicide is not a gun violence issue. Suicide is a mental health issue.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to stop 60 to 65% of actual gun deaths, it's dealing with the issue of suicide. The other percentages, there is a percentage of accidental shootings, and you're absolutely right. That goes into safety, understanding how to use it, and making sure that you're not an idiot. I mean, we know people personally that have been drunk handling firearms, and they haven't killed anyone or killed themselves, but they have caused accidents. You simply cannot do that. And people who are raised around firearms, at least all of them that I know, you are raised to respect the power of a firearm. It's
Right.
not a toy. You don't bring it out at a party. You only take it out if you are shooting it for practice or if you need to use it. And being able to be comfortable with firearms gives you a lot more confidence if you are in a situation in which you need it. So I highly encourage people to go to the range, get practice, go to safety classes. You can't buy a firearm and never utilize it, because that puts you in that category of simply not knowing what you're doing. You have to get comfortable with it, and you have to respect that this can be a incredibly dangerous weapon, and you need to respect that power and put every safeguard possible in place, especially if you have children. But the truth is, a lot of these incidences, they're not kids going into a gun cabinet and getting shot. A lot of times it's stupid adults who are doing the wrong things. They're playing with them and tragedy strikes. So again, I think, the biggest thing we need to focus on is really trying to take a look at mental health and the suicide aspect, because that is by far the biggest percentage of gun crimes or gun violence, if you can even call it that. And then obviously mental health plays into these mass shootings and these murders that take place as well. Yet gun regulation is not how you fix mental health. You fix mental health through strong families, education, and actually trying to help people that are on a downward path instead of just, putting it under the rug.
Right. And I think it also should be noted that I think it's 250 million Americans own a firearm, and that there are 350 to 400 million firearms that are legal in this country. So, we're talking about the 99.9999% of people who are law-abiding and who own a firearm for whatever reason they choose to own one.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm having a TikTok question here, so I'm going to he's asking me to ask you if by carrying a gun, aren't you living in fear? I don't know exactly what he means by that.
Oh, absolutely not. I don't live in fear because I have a gun. I would be foolish to believe that crime doesn't take place in the world. I'd be foolish to believe that people out there can't commit violent acts. We all know that to be true. I hope I never have to shoot my firearm at a person. That's what most gun owners hope. Having something to protect yourself is the way you do not live in fear. I would be fearful walking with my 4-year-old daughter through a dark parking lot without a firearm, knowing that I'm at the mercy of someone else. And the truth is, violent crime has risen exponentially in America in the last year. I simply know that I'm realistic about what happens in the world. I choose not to live in fear, but I choose to take personal responsibility for the safety of myself and for my family. And that's exactly how I feel, knowing that I am in a position to defend myself despite someone else's crazy choices.
Yeah, you bet. Okay, my guest is Allie Bloyd. She's the author of Uncensored America, which is available at Amazon and other venues. Allie, so you want to weigh in on the question of President Biden's plan to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that all of the pending executive orders and potential gun legislation will do absolutely nothing to change actual gun crime in our country. There was a ban on assault weapons, which again, it's very rarely defined.
Well, that goes back to the 1930s. I mean, you can't have, I think that's the Tommy gun law. You can't have an automatic assault weapon on the street. I mean, that was after the St. Valentine's Day massacre.
Yeah, and so most of, the way that these politicians discuss firearms are exactly the way that someone who knows nothing about guns would discuss firearms, or someone who's intentionally trying to deceive others. So we are not able to have automatic weapons. And the truth is that a pistol and something like an AR-15, ultimately, they're going to shoot about the same speed. You can have just as many clips for a pistol, which most gun crimes are committed with pistols. They're not committed with an AR-15 style rifle. Very, very few shootings are committed with rifles, and that is just pure statistics. Pistols are what people do use majority of the time if they are committing a violent act. So doing this and removing this type of weapon off the street does zero for actual gun crime. The truth is, if I am a violent person and I'm intentionally trying to harm others, if I can't get a rifle, that's fine. I'll get a pistol. It's not going to deter criminals. Some of these other executive orders being proposed, and especially HR 127, these types of measures do nothing but hurt or criminalize law-abiding gun owners. The proposition of this mass registry that if HR 127 passes would require every firearm owner to submit exactly what they own and where they have it stored, which will all be public information. It states that in the bill. That is about the craziest thing I've ever heard. Why would we put out there what we own and where it's stored so that any criminal can access that and say, hey, I'm going to go steal some guns today? People who want to steal and commit crimes, it's very easy for them to do that if they know exactly where to go and exactly the spot within that home to go. The other part of it is that they're actually trying to have a federal government officer decide who is mentally stable enough to carry a gun.
Well,
that's about the last thing I'd want.
Now, isn't there a question of whether or not somebody, when you get a firearm, shouldn't somebody have like some licensing involved, like some education, some basic training in terms of how to use it, and maybe some psychological evaluation?
Well, I guess the question is, who's doing the psychological evaluating? What I think is absolutely insane is putting the mental capacity or the psychological state of American citizens to be determined by some bias, partisan federal government officer. They say that they're not only going to do a psychological evaluation on you, they're going to do it on everyone in your family, including ex-spouses. They're also talking about a red flag gun law where it would allow citizens to essentially report someone else that they think could be a danger, where the police department, these people can actually take away your right to own firearms. You've committed no crime. And the truth is, there are people...
They could just be used very randomly by somebody who just doesn't like you and wants to have.
Well, absolutely. There is no standard in terms of what actually makes someone psychologically fit. There are people that, yes, they do have a history of mental instability. Those things would be documented, and those are things that I believe could be addressed, but that's not what is actually being addressed in these bills. And first and foremost, most people that do commit these acts, they haven't been diagnosed with a lot of these things. And sometimes it's somebody who passes a background check, and these people are simply unstable. I think we need to do more, especially for children. A lot of the people committing some of these crimes, they're younger people, and they are deeply disturbed. But I think there is so much that goes into it. But the truth is, if we want to require all these different things for the right to bear arms, first and foremost, personal responsibility. If you're going to own a firearm, it's your personal responsibility to educate yourself. We don't say that any person who's going to have a child is required to go to child rearing classes, when that's the single most important thing that we do is keeping a human person alive.
I wouldn't even want to mention that because there are people who do want that.
Well, I think it's a great thing for any parent to educate themselves on parenting.
They want it to be done like by mandate. They're going to have people. There was also, I think there's a bill I remember years ago in Oregon to basically the government decides whether or not you can get married. So, the social engineers will take advantage of doing any one of these things.
Absolutely. I think we all have to realize we have personal responsibility. If you're going to buy a gun, if you're going to have a kid, if you're going to get married, you need to prepare yourself. You need to educate yourself. You can't expect someone else to do it for you. And if you don't, you will be the one that suffers the consequences. I think the government should not be involved in any way in our daily lives. That is not what the government, especially the federal government, was designed for. They are literally there to provide very specific things, but over time they have increased their own power through adding amendments to the Constitution or simply overreaching and not being challenged on those things. And then that becomes a precedent. And so then they can take, you give them an inch and they take a mile. And that's an example that we've seen throughout the last century. You can't trust them.
I don't think they bother with amendments. Now they just go ahead like this new law about voting is going to give the vote to 16-year-olds. That's not, we had a constitutional amendment for that, for lowering the voting age to 18 back in the 1970s. And that's the proper way to go about it. But now they're just, we're just going to write a law, pass it, and that's that. So, what about, we talked about whether or not it's a good idea to have some training, which I think it is. What about the waiting period? Do you think that that's appropriate? Because every gun in this country is registered. It's kind of a false issue to say otherwise. And if it's not registered, then that's illegal. That's, most of the gun crimes in this country are done by illegal guns, not legal registered guns.
Ultimately, I don't know that the waiting period really does that much. If I am someone who is trying to commit a violent crime, I don't know that I care if I have to wait 5 days versus 10 days. If that person wants to commit that crime, they're going to find a way to do it. And many acts of gun violence, they're not firearms that were recently purchased. There are so many guns on the street that are being, just sold by individuals, which I fully support the right to be able to sell your gun to an individual. But these are, we'll call them black market guns, so to speak. But a lot of those guns were put there by our federal government through a lot of the choices that they've made. And so it's one of those examples of let's flood the country with drugs and then arrest every drug offender or drug addict. Let's flood the country with guns, and now let's try and criminalize people that have guns, or literally try and make it about as impossible as we can for people to legally obtain these, knowing that criminals don't abide by the law regardless, and they will still be able to access guns. Doesn't matter what gun regulations you put, if someone intends to commit a violent crime, they will. And there have been studies that show that the more gun ownership increases, the lower gun crime actually is. And that's because if I'm a criminal and I know that anyone around me could have a gun at any point, I'm going to be a lot more particular about trying to openly commit an act of violence.
You're not gonna attack a house if you think the person behind it has a gun.
Absolutely.
I think that we learned that in Nazi Germany, actually. But the other issue, and this might be more anecdotal, but I had somebody say to me on this question, they said, what about the fact that if you go to a city like Chicago, where they have a good deal of crime with the use of guns on the street, that people can just cross the border from Indiana, where they have a more liberal regulation of gun purchases, and purchase the gun and then bring it into a place like Chicago, which has a much more vigorous gun laws, and what can be done to stop that?
Well, I don't even know if it's the issue of, do we need to stop that? Most of the guns that are in places like Chicago, they're not bought in Indiana. They're bought on the underground market in Chicago. So until we clean up all of these different gun distributors and cartels and gangs and all of these different groups, that they're not going to stop distributing firearms. It's not the states that have very normal gun laws that are the problem. And that type of rhetoric or accusation, it really is there to distract from the fact that Chicago, which has some of the strictest gun control regulations in the country, has one of the worst track records for gun crime. And it's exactly the reason why places like schools or gun-free zones, those are the places where a lot of mass shootings happen, because the people know that those around them, besides the criminals, are unlikely to have guns. And Chicago is a great example of why gun restrictions on law-abiding citizens don't work. It actually makes them sitting ducks for these criminals.
Especially in, frankly, minority neighborhoods where you have gangs and drug gangs. You really don't have the ability to defend yourself, and it's difficult to get in there and to do that. Now, there's the other issue you bring up is the fact that gun ownership and groups like the NRA, they tend to cross political lines. They're not partisan. And I'd point out, for example, that I think that one of the states in this country that has the highest per capita gun ownership by its citizens is Vermont, which is very liberal and very democratic. Connecticut also is a big gun state. So it's one of these issues, and I don't know why somebody like the Biden regime, why they don't understand that it cuts across party lines. The American people support private ownership of guns.
The truth is, I don't truly believe that the people who are aiming to restrict firearms in our country care about what the American people want. I think that that's been proven simply by something like HR 1. 75% of Americans support voter ID. We think it's pretty standard. You need ID for literally everything you do in life. the American people support that. The government wants to change that simply because it benefits them. Any administration, any group that wants to make it harder or impossible for law-abiding citizens to access guns has an agenda where they want an unarmed population. And we have seen that through history. Anyone who studies history understands that the best way to protect your country from enemies, foreign and domestic, including a tyrannical government, firearms is how you do that. That is our check against the government so that they know that we have the ability to fight back should it ever come to that. And nobody wants that, but that is what our founding fathers knew. They had already experienced these situations. They knew the hearts of men are not pure and that power corrupts and that we have to be able to have a defense against that.
We're exactly getting into the basic philosophy of defense. And, and it does go to the example of Nazi Germany. The Weimar Republic before the Nazis disarmed the German population because they said you'll be safe from the gangs of both Nazis and communists who were battling it out of the street. And so then when the Nazis came to power, they had a disarmed population. That way they could bang on someone's door and take them away, knowing that there wasn't going to be somebody on the other side of the door with a gun to stop them. And so people could be put into concentration camps. If you look at a place like communist China, they've got no private ownership of guns. People can be simply taken. If you're reported by the block social worker, if a woman is reported to have an unlawful pregnancy or something, she can be picked up and forcibly aborted. I mean, this is, you can't defend yourself. And I mean, the other example I'd give is that Switzerland, the Nazis decided in the middle of World War II not to invade Switzerland because every able-bodied Swiss from the age of 16 up had a gun and knew how to use it. And there would have been a terrible price to pay for invading Switzerland. There would have been a huge carnage. So they decided to skip it. And I think that when I hear commentators mention that there is no country in the world where you have more private ownership of guns than the United States, and they do it like there's something wrong with us, I view it as a badge of pride. You know, we do have freedom here. You know, we are properly armed and we are balancing power. You can't just install a dictatorship and expect to start going in and grabbing people, because we do have the ability to defend ourselves. That is what the founding fathers had in mind. I mean, at the end of the Civil War, at the Appomattox Courthouse, the reason why Robert E. Lee surrendered his army was because one of the things Grant promised him was that the men could go back home with their guns. He wasn't going to confiscate their guns. It's a basic understanding. It's a basic right.
I totally agree. And I think that we as the American people need to fully understand that and be willing to defend that against all costs, because it is our right. I mean, the fact that we just had a president say to the American people that no amendment to the Constitution is absolute, that is one of the most disturbing things I've ever heard a president say. How dare you tell us that our constitutional amendments are not absolute? They actually are. They're there for a reason, to prevent us from having any fear that they will be removed. Anyone who says that to you does not want the power of the American people. They want full control over what it is you say, over what it is you do, over how you defend your family, knowing that simultaneously many people are pushing to defund the police, which means that if you're trying to defund the police and you also are telling me that I can't have guns, and let's be honest, these regulations, you let them do this, they will take it a step farther and a step farther and a step farther. Who's there to defend us? Nobody. That's why it's up to us to defend ourselves. We have to take responsibility for that.
They'll turn the city over to Antifa and CHOP, basically. So, Allie, let my listeners and viewers know where they can get your book and listen to your program, or any other information you'd like to share.
Yes, I'm so excited that my book just came out. It's called Uncensored America, Thought-Provoking Poetry on Faith, Family, and Freedom. And this is really a book that it's Definitely talking about a lot of these issues that our country is facing, but it's so much more than that. It's really going to give people hope and encouragement, courage and bravery. It's going to help remind you of what's important and what this country was founded on, but in a format that's really easy to read. It's fun to read. It's something that if you don't read a lot of books, this is a book you could read in probably an hour and a half, or you could pick up one, read it now, read another one later. It doesn't matter, but it's very powerful. I'm so excited to share this with everyone. So you can find it on Amazon. You will be able to get it in Barnes and Nobles, different booksellers here very, very soon, or you can go to uncensoredamericabook.com and check it out. But I'm extremely excited about it. And I think that honestly, poetry is a format that actually can change
Oh yeah, you bet.
minds right now. You know, people accept information differently from an art form versus someone writing an op-ed or
It's much
some
more
type
powerful.
of article.
Oh,
Yeah.
for sure. All right, Allie Bloyd, listen, I want to thank you for joining me